118 years. That's how long one ration of dried meat and rendered fat sat sealed before someone finally opened it in 2019, ate it on camera, and walked away fine. But here's the part that should bother you. That wasn't luck. It was engineered on purpose by hand, with fire and patience standing in for a chemistry degree. 16 of these foods survive in the historical record, dug up by archaeologists or written down by the families who ate them. The last one on this list still humbers preppers running vacuum sealers today. Start with the plainest one, because it shows you the whole logic in miniature. Picture a woman on a warm afternoon slicing squash into rings, thin enough that light passes through them, threading each one on a length of cord and hanging the whole strand from a rafter to dry in the sun until it goes stiff and leathery. A ring of dried squash weighs almost nothing and takes up almost no space, which mattered more than you'd think when everything you owned had to survive on your back during a move. Drop it in a pot of water months later and it swells back into something close to fresh. No secret ingredient, just water. Take it out and there's nothing left in there for rot to feed on. Beans followed the exact same rule. Shelled out of their pods by hand, left in the sun until they rattled hard as gravel, then poured into baskets woven tight enough that mice couldn't easily get a grip on the sides. Corn went one step further. Some ears were left whole and hung from drying racks that were built deliberately high off the ground, specifically so the family dog couldn't reach up and help himself. The rest of the harvest was sliced straight off the cob while it was still fresh, spread out on mats and left to dry loose in the open air. Once it was bone dry, it would sit for a full year without complaint and still grind into a flour that baked exactly the way it was supposed to. Then it went underground. All of it. Entire farming communities on the plains dug what archaeologists today call cache pits. Picture a hole shaped almost like a jug, narrow at the neck and bulging wide at the bottom, lined with dry grass or animal hide to hold the temperature steady through a freeze. A Hidatsa woman named Maxidiwak once sat down with an anthropologist in 1910 and sketched her own family's pit from memory, and the drawing shows exactly what went into it: corn, beans, sunflower seeds, dried squash, packed in by the women of the household and sealed under a plug of dirt and woven grass. Some tribes farther south, in the desert southwest, dug in even deeper and fire-hardened the clay walls of the pit from the inside until the surface felt almost like glazed pottery. A hole in the ground, dug and sealed right, could out-preserve a modern pantry. And it did it for free. Sunflower seeds rode along in that same pit, dried first, then poured in right alongside the corn and the squash. They're the most forgotten name on this whole list, easy to skip past for the flashier stuff. But the oil inside a sunflower seed doesn't turn rancid nearly as fast as you'd expect once the moisture's gone. One of the easiest wins in the entire system. Nobody talks about them. Wild rice, up around the Great Lakes, wasn't actually rice at all. It still isn't. It was harvested straight out of canoes, with people knocking the grain loose from the stalks with a stick, then parched over low heat to loosen the tough outer hull before it was dried down hard. In that state, it could sit packed in a woven bag or dropped into a pit for a long stretch and lose almost nothing of itself. It's still harvested and stored close to the exact same way today, by the same families, on the same lakes. Root vegetables got pulled into the system too, and this is where it starts to feel less like farming and more like engineering. Wild turnips, dug out of the prairie sod by tribes across the plains and into the northwest, were peeled and then braided by their own dried stems into long ropes, the way you'd braid garlic or onions in a kitchen today. A single braid could hang from a lodgepole all winter, and every few weeks someone would just walk over and tear off whatever the family needed for that night's pot. Camas bulbs out on the plateau and up through the Pacific Northwest went through fire before they ever went through the sun. And this one takes actual labour to picture right. Dug up by the basketful in early summer, the bulbs were layered into a pit lined with hot stones, covered over with earth, and left to slow bake for a full day, sometimes longer. The heat turned the starch inside sweet, the same way a long, slow oven turns a raw onion sweet. Only after that did the bulbs get pressed flat into cakes and dried. Cakes that could then travel for months without the pit baking ever needing to happen a second time. One day of fire, an entire winter of food. Corn went through its own transformation before it ever hit storage, and not every kernel got the same treatment. Some was soaked and simmered in a mix of water and wood ash until the tough outer hull loosened and slipped away entirely, leaving behind a softened kernel we now call hominy. It held up in storage even better than the plain dried version, and it unlocked nutrients the raw kernel had been hiding the whole time. Something people figured out generations before anyone had a word for chemistry. Berries looked built to fail fast. They got handled the hardest because of it. Chokecherries, huckleberries, wild cranberries, spread out thin on woven mats in direct sun until they shriveled down into something closer to raisins than fruit. Stored dry in a hide pouch, they'd hold for months on their own. But the real trick came when someone stopped leaving them alone and pounded them straight into meat and rendered fat instead. And that's the exact moment this list stops being about drying something out and starts being about building something new. That's Pemmican's whole extended family, actually, and it earns its own full stop before we get to the extreme version at the end. Dried meat pounded down into a coarse powder, mixed while warm with melted fat and crushed dried berries, then pressed into a bag made from an animal's own stomach or bladder and tied off. The Cree called the rendered fat Pemmican. That's exactly where the word comes from. At somewhere around 3,000 calories a pound, a single bag of the stuff could carry a hunting party through weeks they'd otherwise have starved straight through. And the chokecherries mixed in weren't there for flavour alone. They carried vitamin C into a food that would otherwise have quietly handed you scurvy by the end of a long winter. Salmon got its own version of the same instinct, coastal and just as ruthless. Pacific Northwest tribes split the fish open along the spine, hung it on wooden racks over a smouldering, smoky fire for days at a stretch, and turned it into something closer to jerky than to the delicate smoked salmon you'd find on a bagel today. Done right, it carried entire villages through winter months when the rivers ran empty and silent. Whatever surplus was left over got traded inland, sometimes hundreds of miles, to tribes who might never see a salmon run in their entire lives. Land meat took a related but different path to the same result. Thin sliced, trimmed of every scrap of fat, and dried in open air or over low smoke, almost always without salt, because inland salt was often too scarce and too valuable to spend on preservation when smoke and sun did the job for free. The word we use for it now, jerky, isn't even a native North American word at all. It's a straight descendant of charqui, a Quechua word out of South America, carried north over centuries of trade routes until it landed, oddly enough, on a completely different continent's food. Out in California, acorns solved a problem nothing else on this list had. Raw, they're rough on the stomach. Bitter, loaded with tannins that have to be pulled out before the nut is worth eating at all. Some families ground the shelled nuts into a coarse meal and rinsed it inside a shallow sand basin dug beside a creek, letting water run through it for hours, sometimes most of a full day, until the bitterness finally ran clear and the meal tasted sweet instead of sharp. Dried afterward and packed into a raised granary safe from rodents, that acorn flour could reportedly hold for a year or more. And in parts of California, it's estimated to have made up as much as 3/4 of the entire native diet. One oak tree, handled correctly, could quietly outperform a planted grain field. And the leaching itself wasn't a quick rinse. Some families ran the process 7 or 8 separate times before a single batch was judged sweet enough to eat, tasting the meal along the way to know when the bitterness was finally gone. Down in the desert southwest, mesquite did it with a fraction of the effort. The pods themselves are naturally sweet straight off the tree, and were ground whole, husk and all, into a coarse flour that by most accounts held for a long stretch in the dry desert air without turning. Skip the leaching, skip the fire pit too. The desert did half the preservation work before anyone even touched the pod. Maple sap, boiled down for hours over an open fire in the northeast until nearly all the water cooked away, crystallized into a sugar that by its very nature can almost never spoil. Rot needs moisture. Sugar has none left to give it. Gram for gram, it packed nearly the same portable calories as pemmican off a completely different tree in a completely different climate. And then there's fat itself, rendered down slowly from bear or bison and poured warm into a sealed skin, which sounds almost too plain and too simple to belong on a list like this one. But rendered fat, kept airtight and kept cool, could reportedly hold for years, and it was never a side ingredient. It was the binder that made half the other foods on this list actually work in the first place. Strip it out and pemmican is just meat powder and dried berries, stale within a season. None of this stayed contained to the people who invented it. European explorers and fur trappers pushing into the interior in the 18th and 19th centuries had no food system built for months on a canoe route with no resupply. Pemmican did. Traders learned the recipe, adopted it wholesale, and built entire trade networks around it, hauling it by the ton to keep expeditions moving through territory that would otherwise have starved them out within weeks. A preservation method built for a hunting party's winter ended up quietly making large-scale continental exploration possible at all. Nobody puts that on the plaque. Which brings this whole list back around to where it started. Pemmican, made right, with the fat rendered clean and the meat ground fine and every last trace of moisture driven out, is the food modern preppers still can't reliably beat with a vacuum sealer. Wrapped in hide, buried under a layer of wood ash to keep it dry and pest-free, some documented rations have been recovered from old military stores decades after they were first sealed and were still, by every account, edible. The exact upper limit gets argued endlessly online, and nobody who's actually studied this claims one clean, fixed number. But even the conservative end of it, years at room temperature, made from nothing but meat, fat and smoke is still longer than almost anything currently sitting in your refrigerator. 16 foods. No fridge, no plastic bag, no lab. Just people who understood water, fat, smoke and cold better than a lot of modern kitchens ever will. So the next time your groceries quietly go bad after a single week in the fridge, ask yourself what Maxi Diviak's cash pit was doing right that your kitchen isn't. What would it actually take to build something that lasts that long again?